So a little while ago, I released some videos about socialism. I was pleasantly surprised to see how well they were received given the controversial topic, but there were still obviously some people who disagreed. The main arguments I saw against socialism in those comment sections were: 1. Social democracies are preferable to socialism, so countries like America should just strive to be more like Sweden and drop the whole socialism thing. This I already touched on in my last video. It was part 1 of this 2-part series. 2. Venezuela was in fact ruined by socialism. And 3. Anti-socialist Javier Milei is actually doing a good job in Argentina. In this video, I'll tackle the claims about Venezuela and Argentina. If you want to see my thoughts on socialism versus social democracy, then check out part 1. Let's get into it. To serve as a quick reminder, socialism is worker control and democratic management of the means of production, and markets, where and if they exist, are to be subordinate to the well-being of the people. The profit motive is to take a back seat to human well-being. This means you don't go hungry or houseless just because you can't afford those essential goods while excess food gets destroyed and 16 million homes sit vacant and useless. Socialism seems to mean different things to different people. From Leninists to anarchists, the application of socialism doesn't always look the same. Some socialists argue for more state power and centralization. I don't. I perceive such a system to be a deviation from my preferred form of socialism, but socialism nonetheless. I argue for a more decentralized system that restructures the enterprise and democratizes the workplace. Things like worker cooperatives, workers' councils, and dual power structures to mitigate the role of the state and truly empower the working class with greater control over capital.
They have a thing that looks like a government. It's got a parliament, it's got like ministers, and they pass legislation, but they also have the bottom-up structures. The bottom-up structures is what they call democratic confederalism.
With that said, let's get into Venezuela. The US has a history of meddling in Venezuela.
I'm starting work in a foreign country for an American oil company, and I'll have to learn its ways. We each represent the United States here, in the eyes of the Venezuelans.
All the way back in 1908, the US Navy helped to install Juan Vicente Gomez in a coup. Gomez ruled brutally, protected foreign oil interests, and was described as an instrument of foreign control of the Venezuelan economy by Romulo Betancourt, a later Venezuelan president. Gomez wasn't the only US-backed tyrant. America also backed a ruthless dictator named Marcos Perez Jimenez, who was friendly to oil companies and transnational corporations, but brutal to his people. This resulted in Venezuela building an economy based almost solely on oil revenue, selling it off to richer countries like the US, while the US ensured that whoever was in charge of Venezuela would put American interests above those of Venezuelans. This ensured that the rich of Venezuela were taken care of, America remained happy, and the poor of Venezuela suffered. The US remained consistent in meddling in Venezuela and all over Latin America with the goal to profit off Latin American natural resources. In 1998, Hugo Chavez was elected and launched the Bolivarian Revolution. The revolution ushered in social reforms that alleviated poverty and illiteracy, healthcare was prioritized, and industries like oil were nationalized in an attempt to build a more self-sufficient Venezuela. Chavez, knowing that this set the Venezuelan oligarchy against him and made him a pariah in Washington, still chose to supply free heating oil to hundreds of thousands of poor Americans in winter states. The Americans continued to demonize Chavez, attempt coups, and sanction the country. Obama said Venezuela was a risk to national security, which is funny because I don't remember Venezuela backing coups and death squads around the world or drone striking the ever-living f*** out of the Middle East. But I do remember the US doing that. I tell you this not because I have any desire to defend Maduro or even Chavez, but it's important to be aware of this history first and foremost before we get into why Venezuela is the way it is. Venezuela is a petrostate, a very resource-rich one. As is often the case with nations that are rich in a particular resource, we see something called the resource curse, or Dutch disease, take place. This is when a country relies only on their abundant resource, for Venezuela that happens to be oil, and fails to diversify their exports and other economic sectors. Oil has made Venezuela very rich for a very long time, so they never really bothered to flesh out other industries or sectors. They used oil money to import whatever they needed, which further postponed their desire to develop their own industries. This set the stage for what we saw when the value of oil plummeted. Under Chavez's presidency, oil was booming. He brought oil companies under state control, and he used the revenues generated by the high price of oil to fund his social programs. This resulted in him being a very popular president, but also a very sloppy one. With oil single-handedly carrying his economy, he got cocky and wasn't diligently saving oil revenues for the future. He wasn't diversifying his exports or fleshing out other industries. Chavez made a ton of economically illiterate decisions. He devalued the bolivar, leading to inflation, didn't manage or upkeep the oil facilities, and he refused to even learn much about the oil industry, which is pretty silly considering the way Venezuela made its money. When Chavez died in 2013 and the value of oil started to plummet in the years following, Chavez's successor, Maduro, tried to keep Chavez's social programs in place even though the country no longer had the oil revenues needed to maintain them. So Maduro printed money and propped up the foreign exchange rate, leading to hyperinflation. It's important to keep in mind that nationalization and state ownership of oil companies can be a socialist policy. They can also be social democracy policies. But, as we've been over earlier, without the democratic control and management of these industries, and with far too centralized authority, we can easily run into issues like Chavez's poor saving habits, bad industry upkeep, and inability to educate himself on the topic of oil. So if you want to consider Chavez's nationalization of oil industries as proof that Venezuela is a socialist economy and failed because of it, we should probably mention how Chavez's reforms, funded by his nationalization of oil, were arguably some of the better things to happen to Venezuela, and the outcome of his reforms were even praised by neoliberal organizations like the World Bank. We also need to factor in a history of US imperialism, sanctions, coup attempts, extreme corruption, the failure to diversify exports or sectors and remain entirely dependent on oil, economic mismanagement in the form of money printing leading to hyperinflation, and more. My point is, it's easy to blame socialism, even when a lot of the economy is privately held, because it serves as a worthwhile boogeyman and it prevents us from having to thoroughly look at what went wrong. Nicolas Maduro is a so-called socialist and rules over a Venezuela in crisis, so it's easy to just blame socialism. But this fails to address all the times Venezuela experienced crises under more right-wing governments, namely in the 80s and 90s. Back in the 80s, oil prices plummeted and Venezuela's money reserves dried up. The country found itself $33 billion in debt. This led to the country accepting an IMF loan. The IMF is notorious for loaning money to countries in need, but only if that country pledges to implement neoliberal reforms. This means mass privatization and deregulation, cutting social programs, and opening up their economies for foreign investment. Historically, these neoliberal policies have led to immense inequality and poverty. In Venezuela's case, these policies brought about inequality, rioting, looting, and political turmoil long before Chavez's revolution and actually motivated people to support Chavez. Let's jump back to the modern day. The demonization of socialism as the reason for Venezuela's demise sounds good to the average Western anti-leftist, but it fails to keep in mind how Bolivia, a country not too far away from Venezuela, was experiencing solid results under Evo Morales' incremental socialist policies. Evo Morales raised the standard of living, more than half to the number of people living in extreme poverty, grew the GDP by an average of 4.8% a year from 2004 to 2017, was recognized by neoliberal establishments like the World Bank and the IMF for his ability to improve the quality of life in Bolivia, and he even had the World Bank reclassify Bolivia from a lower income country to a lower middle income country once it surpassed the national income per person threshold for lower middle income status. My point here is that there are many factors at play when it comes to Venezuela. To blame socialism or even Chavez for everything that the country is experiencing leaves out the history of the country, the failures under past right-wing leadership, the neoliberal policies that drove people into Chavez's arms, and the overall economic mismanagement and dependency on just one resource. Yes, Maduro is cartoonishly corrupt, and that video of him sneaking a bite of an empanada on live TV because he thought the cameras were off as his people starved is pretty f***ed up. But Maduro is not the embodiment of socialism. Nothing near it, actually. I had some libertarians in the comment section of my past videos claiming I was mistaken on Milei, so let's look a little deeper. Javier Milei is a right-wing libertarian, ostensibly a very principled one. He ran on cutting government spending, mass privatization, and the whole libertarian 9 yards. Typically, libertarians will emphasize the idea of privatizing as much as possible, cutting regulations, social programs and welfare, loosening labor restrictions, and more. Historically, the quick and sudden implementation of these neoliberal free market policies has come to be known as shock therapy in economics. It typically works best coming off the heels of a natural disaster, war, or economic crisis because it utilizes the disorientation of the public in times of hardship to implement these unpopular neoliberal policies with little pushback. If people are preoccupied with the aftermath of a crisis, whatever it may be, they tend to be less efficient at fighting back against the removal of welfare or worker protections. Hell, they might not even notice until it's too late. That's the point. To quote author Naomi Klein, who focuses heavily on the topic of shock therapy, countries are shocked by wars, terror attacks, coup d'etat, and natural disasters. Then they're shocked again by corporations and politicians who exploit the fear and disorientation of this first shock to push through economic shock therapy. And then people who dare to resist this shock politics are, if necessary, shocked for a third time by police, soldiers, and prison interrogators. The latter part of that quote finds itself applicable to Argentina under Milei. When Javier devalued the currency by over 50%, his neoliberal policies caused outrage and sparked protests. A member of his coalition went on to offer the protesters either prison or a bullet. Very libertarian of him. Within only 6 months of Javier Milei's presidency, his intense austerity program is responsible for increasing the poverty rate from 42% to 53%, its highest level since 2003. The child poverty rate is almost 70%. Now, to be fair to Milei, he inherited an Argentina that was already in an economic crisis. Remember what I said about shock therapy? It works best off the heels of a crisis. He was able to cool inflation and boast the first budget surplus in a long while, but he did this at the expense of the poor. I'll build on this in a bit. Keep in mind, the goal of these neoliberal policies is to open up markets for foreign private investment, keep the capitalist class as rich as possible, and just maybe shit will trickle down to the people at the bottom. Milei went on to slash energy subsidies, leading to a 360% increase in subway fares. He scrapped price controls, meaning that, for some, essential goods and rent were impossible to pay for. To quote an article by the Associated Press, "People are in pain," said 23-year-old Agustin Perez, a supermarket worker in the suburbs of Buenos Aires, who said his rent had soared by 90% since Milei deregulated the real estate market, and his electricity bill had nearly tripled since the government slashed subsidies. They say things are getting better, but how? I don't understand. Let's look at the plus side real quick. So it is true that month-over-month inflation has cooled due to Milei's austerity policies, but this came at the cost of devaluing the currency, slashing subsidies and price controls, and overall, leaving a majority of the population under the poverty line. The world that the government lives in, with all these numbers saying the economy is great, it's a fantasy, said a 34-year-old taxi driver in Buenos Aires. In the real world, this economy makes it really hard to feed my son. This is an example of the difference between how the economy looks and how it actually serves the people. So when Milei boasts about having the first financial surplus in years, keep in mind that he is failing to mention that this was only possible after implementing the largest public spending slash in 3 decades, steep increases in food, rent, and gas prices, and cruel austerity measures that resulted in mass protests and strikes. The intense devaluing of the Argentine peso can be interpreted as Milei's attempt to ditch the currency. He's openly flirted with the idea of Argentina rebuking their monetary sovereignty and just adopting the US dollar. This devaluing of the peso has left hard-working people unable to use their paychecks, with reports of a growing hunger crisis in the country. I mean, at this point, Milei might as well be getting his economic advice from his dogs. He does do that. I'm sure he's just joking. That's all for now. If you want more unscripted content from me, check out my second channel here. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up, comment, and subscribe. If you disagree with anything I said, let me know why. Thanks.